Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's topic and lesson and reading is on the 1920s in the United States. The 1920s, of course, becomes associated with superstar personalities like the great baseball player Babe Ruth, um, film stars like Charlie Chaplin, the great pilot and American personality Charles Lindbergh, the great manufacturer Henry Ford, famous for making Ford Motor Company and cars like the Model T, a staple of American industry and economics. It's a period associated with the era of Prohibition and with a widespread prevalence of illegal drinking and illegal bootlegging of alcohol. And of course, it's in the 1920s where we see a real explosion of gangsterism in the United States, and most of that gangsterism was really kickstarted up on the basis of the Prohibition period. Of course, folks like Al Capone, the Chicago gangster, made much of his legacy and his wealth on the illegal alcohol trade. And so this led to a great deal of violence in the 1920s and gangsterism in the 1920s. Events like the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre, for example, just one of many examples of gang violence in the 1920s associated with the period of Prohibition. The 1920s is also associated with a sort of boom period for the American stock market, and also for a period associated with sort of less regulatory approaches, small government approaches on the part of American political leaders in the White House, which was really a reaction to the progressive era, which was led by, of course, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and, of course, Woodrow Wilson. The 1920s instead was dominated by at least more of, a laissez-faire approach to economic and social policy in the 1920s in the United States. And of course, the 1920s sets up the stock market crash of 1929 and also sets up, in that respect, the Great Depression, which will dominate the 1930s and which we will talk about in subsequent classes to come. This week, so we've just finished our first section in this class. And so now, at the end of each section during the term, you have the option of writing one of the papers. Remember, you only have to write one paper in this class, and you get three options to write the paper. Each paper is meant to be based on a topic of your choosing that is based on the section that we just dealt with. So in this section, you could write a paper that related to Reconstruction. You could write a paper that related to the Gilded Age. You could write a paper that related to the Progressive Era, to the emergence of the United States as an empire, the Spanish-American War. You could write a paper on the First World War. What I want you to do, the paper is about 600 to 700 words. That's what I want, is between 600 and 700 words. No less than 600 words. You will lose points if you go under. As long as it's reasonable, you will not lose points for going over. So if your paper winds up being 900 words, that's fine. You don't have to worry about that. What I want you to do is I want you to consider an aspect of something we've learned so far and write a brief paper on it that makes a historical argument. So another thing I want three different academic sources. Your textbook can be one. Some of the primary sources that we've looked at in this class can also be used. You can go to our SCF library physically or check out the databases. You can all access that. Look for newspaper articles, for example. We have the New York Times Historical. You can research any historical story from the New York Times since 1851. We have sites like JSTOR. We also have access to a number of journals that can give you access to historical academic articles on the subject. Remember, I want academic materials. And remember, when you cite, make sure you include the full author, title, and publisher information. In terms of citing the actual text, you can use parenthetical citation. Just use what you're comfortable with, as long as you're consistent. So if you want to use parenthetical citation when citing in the text, that's fine. List your sources at the bottom. Or if you want to use MLA or APA or Chicago style, whatever you want to do. If any of you want to become a historian, just by the way, I highly recommend you use Chicago style. Because that is the notation style that historians use. So when you would go on, to advanced study in the field, you would need to use Chicago style, and you can access that online. Chicago style, just put it into Google, and you'll find a little guide for Chicago style citations. I want you to make a historical argument. Choose an aspect of the subject that you're interested in. Do a little more research on it, as I just pointed out. Make an argument about it. And I don't want papers that just summarize. I don't need factual summarizing. What I want is a paper that writes an introduction, that presents an argument, provides a few paragraphs that provide evidence to support that argument, and then concludes. A good way to think about how to make an argument is to think about, how does this matter to our world today? Like, ask yourself questions that encourage analysis. Like, how has this shaped our present world? How does this matter, to our world today? So, like, we talked about social Darwinism in this class. We talked about the Industrial Revolution, the tremendous inequalities that existed in the United States during the late 1800s, and we read documents from both a kind of reformer-minded, early progressive, and then we read some documents from, or a document from, a premier social Darwinist of the time, of course. And so you could totally write a paper where you talked about the inequalities of the late industrial period and the emergence of the social Darwin debate, and then you could argue that those debates are still pertinent in our world today, which they very much are. Political leaders are still having these debates. If you will, it's kind of like, in contemporary politics of the 21st century, it's sort of like the difference between a libertarian, like a Rand Paul, for example, versus a more social democrat like Bernie Sanders. One is arguing for very limited government and sort of let the chips fall as they may. The other is arguing for greater regulation to improve overall social equality for people. And that's really the debate that was happening in the Gilded Age. And so you could totally write a paper that was about Gilded Age America, use the sources we used in class, use the material in the book, and argue that that debate has changed but is still relevant in the United States today. You could talk about, for example, how the automotive industry has transformed how we live in the world today, and how that transformation was linked to the emergence of mass production of consumer automobiles under the leadership of Henry Ford, and how that transformed American life. There's a number of avenues you could take that. You could talk about air pollution. You could talk about how that's changed city development. You could talk about how that's changed many aspects of American life. So this is just a couple of examples. You could talk about how we're still living with certain aspects of inequality that stem from the failures of Reconstruction. You could write a paper about the debate over Civil War monuments in this country, because most of those monuments were constructed during the period we're talking about. Most of the ones that were up for debate in recent past, those monuments were, many of those monuments, like the one that became really controversial up at the UVA campus, were erected in the early 20th century. They were not erected immediately after the Civil War. They were erected almost a half a century, if not a half century, after the American Civil War. And so you could write a paper about how American society at that time remembered the American Civil War and how we're still dealing with that remembering today. So this is just a few examples, just off the top of my head, of great argumentative historical pieces that you could research and write about for a short paper like this. It's just an example. I don't want you to just write a summary paper. I don't want you to say, the Spanish-American War began after the Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and then just describe the events. I want you to explain, what does this mean? What does it mean, the United States becoming a world power? How has that remained significant for us today? Okay, I hope that's enough. I wanted to give you a little bit of deeper information on the paper. Here's the factoid. We're running out of time because I know you guys don't want to listen to me banter for too long. So the factoid for this week is this. Just email me this by Wednesday. You get that bonus point of the test. So just shoot me an email and let me know what the factoid is that I'm telling you here. The factoid is this. During the 1920s, we saw the emergence of what is often been known as rum running or rum runners. And in New York City, Rum runners were often boats that would go out away from the city, and they would meet larger smuggling boats that were in international waters that had illegal alcohol on them. And the rum runners, these smaller boats, would go there under veil of darkness, pick up the illegal booze, because this was the time of prohibition, pick up the illegal booze and run it back into New York City, running great risk, of course, of arrest, where it would then be sold at a marked up price to illegal bars, which were called speakeasies. And speakeasies were unadvertised bars that you kind of had, you knew the word on the street, you knew how to go there, and many of them might have a password at the door. In many cases, there'd be illegal gambling in these places. They were frequented by many Americans of great status, especially in cities. Babe Ruth, for example, was one of the most well-known figures in the 1920s who would have frequented many a speakeasy. As you know, Americans did not stop drinking during Prohibition. The drinking just went underground. In one famous case, by the way, Babe Ruth was kind of in trouble with the Yankees manager Miller Huggins, and Babe Ruth sort of embodied the 1920s. And Babe Ruth was out on a wild night, and Miller Huggins said Babe Ruth kept on missing batting practice, and Miller Huggins said, if Babe Ruth misses another batting practice, I'm gonna really lay into him. And Babe Ruth showed up like 5 minutes before the game. He's all hung over, He tosses his cap, misses batting practice, and he hit he was like 2 home runs, a double and a single or something in the game, ridiculous numbers. And Miller Huggins certainly didn't say anything to him, and that kind of embodied the culture of the 1920s. So rum runners. A product of the Prohibition period of the 1920s. Okay, guys, let's have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions at all. Okay.